Come in, sit down. Ladies and gentlemen, please come and take your seats. And also, if you're on the panel, please come and join the panel. Okay, we're going to get started within a few, tens of seconds. Could we also have the music off, please, at the back? Thank you very much. Thank you, lovely sound people. Very sound people. Okay, so we're on to our next panel, and this is going to be chaired by our very own James Durie. James started his career as a chartered surveyor practicing in London, but is obviously our very own Executive Director of Business West and CEO of the Bristol Chamber of Commerce and Initiative. Man of many boards, West of England LEP, BBRC Advisory, and also co-chair of the Bristol One City Economy Board. James and I have worked and plotted together for many years. Really looking forward to this session. Away to you all.
Now switched on. Good afternoon to everybody. Great to see lots of people. It's so good to be back together, seeing people, I have to say. And we've organised the weather for you today. So this session today, in a moment, I'm going to briefly introduce, and they're really going to introduce themselves. We've got a small panel here, beautifully formed, to talk to you and for us to have a discussion, I think, in the room, a bit about business taking action to reduce emissions. Clearly a big part of the theme of Absolute today, and try and get some practical ideas and energy going, because as Simon Roberts was particularly talking about earlier, a lot about what we want to encourage Business West and lots of different partners, the council, etc., is to get that exchange of energy and ideas. And I think trying to bring that out and try and encapsulate what business is doing. People are on different parts of this journey. So starting, despite what I said, actually, I'm going to just slightly change the order. I'm going to briefly introduce our far end. We have Stuart Davidson, who's from a company called Edwards Vacuum. Then we have Phil Walters, who's from Rolls-Royce. We have Sophie Lawrence, who's from Rathbones Greenbank. And James Wogan, immediately to my right here from Wogan, a well-known local coffee company. So I'm just going to briefly ask each of you, perhaps I'm starting from the far end, Stuart, just give us Stuart, briefly explain a little bit about your business, what you do, and then in terms of your take on the environmental side and how you've embracing sustainability. So.
Hi everyone, I'm Stuart, as you introduced there. I work for Edwards Vacuum, and we predominantly make vacuum and environmental abatement systems for the semiconductor market. It's a $400 billion market, and our environmental research and development manufacturing site is actually based in North Somerset. So the environment has been a core aspect of our business for over 30 years. So we've been on the front line of fighting climate change for a bit longer than the politicians that we've got around at the moment. We've got over 600 people working at our site in Clevedon. And yeah, that's about it, really.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So coming to you, Phil, next from Rolls-Royce.
Afternoon, everyone. My name's Phil. I work for Rolls-Royce. I've done for nearly 17 odd years now. My role is strategy development exec, looking after the site infrastructure in Bristol. So we employ just under 2,500 people in Bristol out of a global team of 44,000. We are an industrial technology company, primarily, I guess, associated with aerospace propulsion and industrial power systems. So I guess twofold for us. There is the markets that we operate. They are very hard to decarbonise, but we absolutely see that as an opportunity as well as a societal imperative to address. But really where I spend a lot of my time is how we can get the Bristol site and Rolls-Royce sites generally to be in carbon neutral.
Thank you, Phil. And Sophie.
Yeah, hi everyone. Sophie Lawrence from Rathbone Greenbank Investments. So we provide investment services for clients who are wanting to align their values and also their sustainable development priorities with their investments, which is really important. We've been around since the 1990s, now got a lot of other people on our feet competing in that area of investment. But it's a really exciting area, and I led our net zero strategy, which I'll be talking to you a lot more about as we go on with this panel. Great to be here.
Thank you. And James.
Yeah, so I'm James Wogan of Wogan Coffee. We are a coffee roastery in the centre of Bristol. It's a third generation family business, and yeah, that's pretty much it. We roast coffee.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question which I'm going to ask each of you to briefly touch on, just to give us a sense about what are the things that, and you will be in different parts of this journey, do it in different ways, but what are the simple things a business like yours has done and could do further around embracing decarbonisation and sustainability? Stuart.
I think in our Clevedon site in North Somerset, one of the big things has been recycling, reuse of materials we've got. But simple things is we're doubling the size of our factory in the next 6 months. But as part of that, we're putting up, I think it's 1,500 metres squared of solar panels on the roof. Rainwater reusage, you know, there's an awful lot of toilet flushing, and you don't want to really get them to just wait for the second person to flush the toilet. You want to have a nice environment to work in. So we're reharvesting some of the water there. Heat pumps, we were talking about earlier, but if industries like ours say we want heat pumps, then it drives it forward and it'll help the rest of the community. You know, we'll have more plumbers that can fit in and electricians that could do heat pumps. That's some of the things that we're looking to. But it's decarbonising the grid is our big thing. You know, when we take our electricity, source it from renewables, that's our big thing. That's our big source of kind of reduce our carbon footprint.
Okay, thank you. Phil.
So I guess if I talk about site, we were talking about this actually at the back. It starts off doing the stuff that you would do at home. And if you're doing it at home and you're not doing it at work, why is that? So we started off 2014, motion sensors in buildings, replacing everything with LED lights. A couple of years ago, we put in just under 3.5 megawatts of solar panels and our first ground source heat pump. Going forward, we're in the middle of our second ground source heat project. So there's not been many people on site through COVID, but I have for a lot of it, and I've been accompanied by a 20-foot tall vertical driller for all of it, putting in 50, 120 metre deep boreholes. We've got more solar coming in next year as part of a distributed generation project, along with more EV charging. So that combined together will get us to be in net zero next year for those who are with the jargon, scope 1 and 2 for the Bristol site, which will be a first for Rolls-Royce. And I think it was important for us to show to our supply chain it can be done in a sort of heavy industry, because too often you can get fobbed off with, well, you can do that in an office, but how about a factory?
Okay, thank you. That's great news to hear for next year. So, Sophie.
Yeah, so really where we started, which is where I'd encourage everyone to start, is kind of measuring our carbon footprint. And when we did that, we were quite surprised, although, I mean, we were surprised, but we knew that this was going to be the case, that 99, and actually more than 99% of our impact was in our investments, so in our scope 3. So we've talked a bit about scope 3, and I am conscious that that isn't familiar for everyone, but this is essentially the bit that we aren't directly controlling, but it's still in our value chain. And we need to, as investors, have an impact on that, especially when over 99% of our emissions are coming from there. So that's been the really big challenge for us. About 3 years ago, we joined, and I'm going to try not to use much jargon, but it's almost impossible to not mention any organisations. But the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change ran a really interesting initiative called the Paris Aligned Investment Initiative. And it was really trying to address some of the challenges in this area and develop a way for investors to actually get to net zero in a credible way. So we were part of that project, and we're now using that net zero investment framework to implement our strategy. And really what that means in reality, and I can appreciate it sort of seems quite abstract when we talk about it theoretically, but what that means is we're all looking at the same kinds of criteria when we're assessing the alignment of our holdings. So we're not just looking at their targets and their strategy, that's really important, but as we all know, there is some greenwash there, and also there's some companies where they haven't had the track record of achieving their targets. So we have to combine that with the emissions performance, scope 1, 2, and 3, again, really 3 being the real challenge. And also for the higher carbon impact, it's really looking in detail at their decarbonisation strategy, and also where they're putting their capital. You know, it's all good and well saying you're moving to net zero, but what does that capital allocation look like? So those are just some of the things that we've really had to think about when we're focusing really in on where our highest impacts are.
Thank you, Sophie. And James, I mean, it'd be interesting to get your comment, slightly different from the other three in terms of a smaller business, but certainly serving, particularly I'd say a B2C, but clearly also some B2B audiences. But give us your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we're a smaller production. Yeah, I mean, we sort of started with the small and obvious stuff, to be honest. So, you know, like you said, LED lights, it seems ridiculous, but obviously. Changing all of the way that everything's heated in our space. And then we started getting a bit more creative. So we started doing things like, so we've got 2 old roasters, decades old. When we refurbed them, put on brand new burners that are significantly more efficient than anything else was before. And then we started applying that through everything. So in every area that we could, we were just upgrading stuff and updating things to just be slightly more friendly. We then started looking at deliveries. So I know Simon's here somewhere. Hey, he's over there. We started using Zedify to do local Bristol deliveries, things like that, which to be honest, I'd never thought about. And now they do zero emissions deliveries for us for domestic customers. We started then applying that to the deliveries we do ourselves. So suddenly we really made everything far more efficient. Every van's completely full. You reduce road miles, you know, standard things. And then we moved on to the larger stuff. So we, only about a month ago, actually thanks to the Low Carbon Challenge Fund, if they're here, we actually got a grant for solar panels, which is amazing, which now should produce in a year our entire electricity consumption, which is great. Couple of electric cars already, and then yeah, we're planning on having an all-electric fleet as soon as electric vans are actually available. But yeah, that's our sort of next main thing.
And can I ask, just to come back on a question really there, what's driving it? Is it from
necessity.
The management? Is it from your staff? Is it your customers? Is it what's the prime driver behind it?
So I started about 4 years ago, and to be honest, I made it a bit of a challenge for myself, because it's a necessity. It's not a matter of just, you know, it being, oh, it's a nice thing to do, or you know, doing what we can. It's simply a necessity that everyone reduces carbon as much as they can. I mean, obviously it has benefits, you know, it's a nice thing to be seen as a really sustainable company. But no, for me at least, and for the business at least, it's the driver's necessity.
Okay, and if you were trying to advise or suggest for a business who are right at the early stages, what's the first thing you would do?
I mean, yeah, get to know how much carbon you're actually using is fantastic. But I mean, we started with, the really obvious things: heating, lighting, motion sensors, etc. That sort of area. It's small. I mean, we even changed our box sizes. It sounds ridiculous, but we slightly increased the size of our boxes, and then suddenly realized that we could fit 3 kilos more in with the tiniest little movement of cardboard. We just started looking at all the different areas where it had been, because obviously we've been going for 51 years. We started looking at all the areas where we just sort of kind of accepted how things were, and then just decided, well, there's no reason to.
And as a smaller business, are you able to make a formal commitment to be a net zero by a certain date, or have you?
I mean, well, yeah, we're trying for obviously the 2030. I think, to be honest, it's not easy, but there's elements that obviously are quite easy for us. The difficulties are gas, because roasters run on gas. Unfortunately, electric roasters are just, to put it simply, a little bit crap at the moment. And so trying to work through that's a really difficult one. That's why we did the new modulators, the new burners, because at least it reduced it. And then obviously shipping. We have 20 different origins supplying us from all over the world. Trying to reduce that shipping is almost impossible. And it's, to be honest, it's probably for quite a while, it's going to be a thing that we're going to have to offset. But, you know, we're doing what we can.
Okay. Sophie, from your perspective, you said that the Scope 3, perhaps the funds you manage, is where a lot of the carbon is embedded in terms of you as an organisation. But do you think that comes at a premium price for people to choose to go down the more sustainable funds? And there's a price for people have to, a discount that has to be put in, or a premium price?
No, I don't think so. I think really for us at Greenbank, we're thinking about kind of the long-term, trajectory in terms of company resilience. And actually, if these companies are managing their kind of environmental and social impact, we believe they're going to be good long-term financial investments. And that is what we have seen, and the data has shown. So I don't think you need to sacrifice returns, and the data really has shown that.
Yeah. And are you able to actually push some of your funds to say that you've got to go faster, further and faster?
Yeah, definitely. So really that's the main way we can get to our net zero goal for our investments, is through engagement. So again, that's a term that we use a lot in the investor space. Is essentially how we use our shareholder voice to influence change in the companies that we own. And I think to date, there's been a lot of work done in that area. At Greenbank, I mentioned that we were founded in the 1990s. We were some of the sort of earliest investors to try and lock in climate ambition, with shareholder resolutions kind of in the early 2000s and through the kind of last decade. But we've now got to we're really recognising that we can't just continuously engage. If we're not seeing the progress that we need to take stronger action. So there's now a real recognition that you need to have very clear engagement plans with really defined outcomes that you want to see from companies over a certain time frame. So we mentioned it a few times, it's mentioned already today. It's not just good having a target, it needs to be smart, it needs to be time bound. So that's really what we're working on now. As we move to kind of implementing the strategy, we need really clear kind of engagement plan to sit alongside that. And if we don't see what we want to see from these companies, we're going to have to seriously think about divesting from them as well.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions in here around the supply chains, asking Phil and then Stuart. Just give us a sense about how Rolls-Royce going about actually working with your, perhaps supporting as well as kind of pushing your supply chain to meet the kind of the carbon targets you've set the business.
Okay. No, I think this starts with sharing the journey that you've been on. So part of the installation that we're putting in will feature a visitor centre where we can bring people on site and show them what we've done. We're starting to build that into contract talks. So I guess similar to what you were talking about where you invest, but where you buy. I mean, we've been very public about our commitments, about our plan. We don't necessarily have all the technical solutions to achieve that plan yet, but we know where we're going and we know where we're going to be by various dates, and flowing that down to our supply chain and making it's non-negotiable. We are going to get there, is how we're starting to get some traction. Some scepticism out there, but that's why we want to get ourselves in the right place first.
Stuart, before I come to you, I'm just going to say in a moment, I'm just going to see if I've got time. There's a question I can take from the audience, but Jay, you wave at me when I'm out of time. But Stuart, can I come to you?
Yeah, I think with our role, we're quite on both ends of the supply chain, so persuading our supply chain on the same aspects that we're looking at, decarbonising their power, but also the other way. A lot of our business goes abroad, to China, to Asia, to the States, a bit like Rolls-Royce and that as well. But it's helping that we were talking about the Scope 3. That's the biggest challenge in any supply chain when you're looking on. So looking at our suppliers is assisting them and explaining to them what we want to do and measuring their carbon footprint. But also, we have a huge challenge in our Scope 3 where it's not really always in our control, but it won't stop us doing it. And to give you an idea, we were talking earlier on, our environmental equipment in 2020 was 17.7 million CO2 equivalent that we saved, which is about 2/3 of the carbon footprint of the whole southwest of England. Okay. And that's just in 1 year. So, but it's both ends. It's the Scope 1 and 2 and our suppliers coming in, but there's a big option on the Scope 3. That's the part of the challenge.
Okay. Looks like I've run us out of time, but can I have to round things up? I know there was one or two questions I touched on briefly on the chat here from outside of the room here today. But can I thank very much the panel very much and ask you all to say thank you in the usual way. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone on the panel. Thank you, James. I'm hoping that the panel members will also be sticking around so that you can ask some questions afterwards. Do not think this is the end of the discussion. But we will move swiftly on to panel 2, being chaired by our amazing Richard Bonner, who was my predecessor as president of the Chamber of Commerce and Initiative, but has now stepped into the chair position at our LEP. He is also Chief Operating Officer at Arcadis, which has already committed to some very aspirational and inspirational goals on net zero by 2035. Richard's leadership of our chamber has been over the most challenging years facing business, Brexit, pandemic, the usual kind of thing. He set a very high bar, but now we get to see him in action on the panel. To you.
Thank you. We'll grab a pew. Hi. Where's your seat?
So Burgess Salmon has a really collaborative culture, and responsible business is really embedded within that. There's a real authenticity and a real ambition to make a difference. When it comes to reducing emissions, we've made a lot of progress. We've got a great foundation with an environmental management system. We've done things like switch to renewable energy and use energy efficient machinery. The building here is BREEAM rated excellent, so very energy efficient already. We've committed to being net zero by 2026, and that's for those direct emissions and also our scope 3 business travel. Looking to meet the target, it's absolutely essential to sort of take that approach of reduce, reuse, recycle. If you don't consume in the first place, that's a really good, strong starting point. We're also investing in carbon offsets for the residual carbon emissions that we can't avoid. And we've chosen a project up in Scotland that has rewilding and conservation benefits. We had a real focus on reducing our hospitality food waste and made great strides in achieving that. And that can't be done without, the support of our suppliers. And they've been absolutely fantastic. In terms of the future, I think it's getting greater drive behind net zero and positive action on climate. Obviously, being based in Bristol with the One City plan, it's a great city to be in. And it's also going to take a lot of collaboration. It's not going to be one business or one organisation. We all need to work together. I do feel positive about the future. I'm a real optimist. I also think the human race has done some incredible things, and climate is a challenge we need to focus on. But I believe we can do what needs to be done.
Thank you, and good afternoon and welcome everybody. I'm really delighted to host the second roundtable session, and today we're going to be talking about national, regional, local implications and policies, and we've got a great panel to talk through those issues. So I have Anne Cousin here from Arup, who is also part of the City Office, Stephen from Bristol City Council, Stephen Peacock, nice to meet you, Barry Wyatt, thank you for joining us, you're the Climate Emergency Manager at South Gloss, and John Rassenberg, thank you very much for joining us, part of the South West Renewable Hub and also from the Combined Authority. So just to, I think, share a few of my own reflections very briefly, we know, we've heard today that as business leaders, we have many of our own responsibilities, and we've already heard some great examples of business taking their own initiatives. But we also have heard from Marvin and others that there needs to be a policy framework within which we have to work. And we've also heard how much we need to collaborate across many different aspects of what we're doing. I've been struck by a couple of things from COP over the last couple of days. I was really pleased to hear that cities are really being highlighted as the places where we have got to innovate and drive action. And I think we'll hear a little bit more about what we're doing in the city region. I was also really heartened by a statement the Queen made, actually, and that is we have to look beyond the short-term political cycles and act as statesmen. we have to put in place the long-term thinking. And I think all of us on the panel today recognise that we work not just to short-term cycles, but we have to look to those longer-term strategies. And it's really important that we help to influence the policies that get us to those points. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Anne to open the proceedings for us. And Anne, perhaps talk a little bit about your roles, but also I'm really interested to hear what you see from national policies and perhaps work in other cities around the country.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. So, hello everybody, I'm Anne Cousins from Arup. So we're a built environment consultancy, and I provide climate and sustainability advice to businesses and the public sector. And I guess in thinking about this challenge, and I was sort of asked to try and summarise national policy and climate change in 3 minutes, and I thought, blimey, that's a bit hard. How can I possibly do that with all of the policy that's come out in the last few weeks? And I thought maybe instead of doing that, it would be good to take a step back and think about what is policy for. So we heard Marvin say at the beginning that climate action is going to really happen in cities and be undertaken by businesses. So policy, therefore, provides the framing for all of us to take that action. And policy can be in the form of a vision and targets. It can be in the form of incentives, financial incentives like loans and grants, or it can be in the form of financial disincentives through tax, or it can be through kind of regulation and stopping us from doing things. And in England, most of that power to make that policy sits with central government. And so it's been great to see the Net Zero strategy and the heat and building strategy come out from central government in the last few weeks, and that sets a kind of clear direction of travel. But as we've heard, there's still gaps in kind of how that filters through to us in cities and businesses. So we've got the policy and strategy, but as Marvin said, there's a £1 billion gap in terms of investment for cities, and we didn't necessarily see the follow-through that we might have hoped for in the budget after the Net Zero strategy. So maybe that just gives us
we can pick a bit more of that on later as well. Thank you. And Stephen, I know that there's a lot going on through the city. I'd be really interested to hear, perhaps following Marvin's intro, the work of the city and how we're helping to influence, and perhaps some of the thoughts from yesterday's finance meetings.
Thanks, Richard. Yes, so Stephen Peacock, I look after city services for the council, regeneration, housing, transport, etc. Also our work around net zero, of course. So I think to build on what you've just said, I mean, first of all, we've got to take care of our own business. So actually, the council has committed to getting to net zero in its own estate by 2025. I think we committed to doing our very best.
Yes.
I think everybody is doing their best, because clearly that's tricky. We've done the easy bits, now we've got the hard stuff to do. But it starts at home, and you have to do that first. We've obviously got our powers to do more than that, and I think I'll go to the sort of the top of that and then come back, because the things that Marvin was talking about really do matter, and Anna's alluded to the fact that yesterday at COP, which I was at an event up there as well, the UK Cities Climate Investment Commission putting something out there that says this is how much it's going to take UK core cities and all London boroughs to net zero is filling in that piece of the jigsaw that I feel, in a sense, we can all see coming together, but quite late. Yeah. You'd have expected it to have happened about 9 months ago, but never mind. We're doing it now. What's so striking about it is we've effectively said as cities, this is what we think we need to put that together, looking for new models of collaboration with private finance, because that's what you need, a blended approach to de-risking and patient capital and all those things. Mark Carney said there's about 130 trillion knocking around. Rishi Sunak has made some statements about the net zero financial centre. So effectively what's missing, well, I think what we see is what's missing is how do you make the markets out of all of that? What do you do to actually turn demonstrator scale retrofit heat pumps into, in effect, a commercial proposition? The reference to offshore wind is interesting because it did happen. There was price signals put in, innovation came in, money crowded in, cost of delivery went down. How do you manage to do that in something as fragmented as a world of heat pumps? But yeah, I think a lot of appetite, a lot of intent, and I think I can see things moving quite fast. Cities have got a key part to play, We're a very centralised economy, however, and it's up to Treasury to a degree as to how they want to play that.
And I think we'll talk a little bit more later on around how we can help to influence policy potentially through the work of business to work with city leaders. Thank you for that. Barry, obviously there's lots of work going on further north in our city region, and I'd be really interested to take the views from your work with South Gloss as well.
Thank you. I'm Barry Wise. I'm Climate Emergency Manager from South Gloss Council. Just in terms of my background, I was brought into South Gloss just after they declared a climate emergency back in July 2019. And since that time, we've created that plan, we've created that strategy, we've created those annual action plans. And as ever, taken very much by what Simon Roberts has said earlier in terms of, I see my role as translating those whats and the whys into the hows. So it's all about operationalising what that national policy is at the local level, and trying to actually think ahead of what that national policy leads to and how we can, as I say, bring that to life at a local level. One of the things in terms of South Gloss that we've spent quite a lot of time doing in the last year is to carry out this piece of work called a renewable energy resource assessment. So recognising the energy white paper, 40 gig offshore isn't going to quite do it all. There's still the need for lots more onshore renewable. So what's the role of local government in terms of understanding what capacity it can deliver for that onshore renewable gap? So we spent quite a lot of time doing this renewable energy resource assessment. So what that will do from a local government point of view and a council point of view, so it spans across South Gloss, Baines and North Somerset. It puts us in a really strong position to try to develop that evidence base into planning policy, so we can be quite clear in expressing where we think that potential lies to free up the market, to direct that market to the locations where that maximum opportunity exists. Scope 1 and 2 has been mentioned extensively today. I'm aware that a proportion of South Gloss's emissions, the council is responsible for 1.2% from its Scope 1, or Scope 1 and 2. Scope 3 is roughly about 6% of South Gloss's emissions. But actually I think that misses the point in terms of local government, in terms of our influence and our range of control over the bigger picture. The figures range from anything from 40 to 50% of an area's emissions are within the direct influence of the local authorities. And I think that puts the local authorities in a really strong position to control, manage, encourage and enable others to take action.
Thank you very much, Barry. And John, obviously really interested to hear a little bit more about the South West Energy Hub and some of the initiatives that the Combined Authority are working on.
Yeah, thanks Richard. So I'm John Rattenbury. I manage the South West Energy Hub. We operate across the wider South West region. We work with organisations to help them identify and develop energy projects and net zero projects across a range of different technologies, so heat, electricity, planning, working with grid operators, and we also help to fund a number of events as part of the COP26 fortnight. So we funded 5 in the wider region that are happening across the southwest in the COP fortnight, and they're part of 25 that are happening across the whole country during the COP fortnight. And those events are really good at kind of showcasing local activity and the role of local actors in kind of making change happen in this environment. So at the Energy Hub, we're hosted by the West of England Combined Authority, and the Combined Authority itself declared a climate emergency, seeking to achieve net zero by 2030. And it's going through a process now of updating its action plan to make it more ambitious, recognising the need to do more sooner. And that includes actions around kind of retrofits, so trying to increase the amount of housing retrofit activity that's happening, both through increasing funding, looking to bring forward a 50 million retrofit fund, but also looking to bring forward innovative practices in housing retrofit. It's also just recently received a 540 million settlement for its sustainable transport policy and plan. And that's really looking at developing strategic transport corridors through the West of England, helping to invest more in walking and cycling in the region, and also helping to improve bus services and train routes, so that it really gives people options to kind of get out of their cars and switch their mode of transport. We also have the Low Carbon Challenge Fund and the Green Business Grants Programme. So that support directly for businesses, and that's a 1.7 million programme for businesses. And so far, 65 businesses have accessed about £650,000 to help them understand where they can make a difference. And you heard an example from the coffee company earlier where they used that grant to install solar panels on the roof. There's £1 million left of the Green Business Grant, so there's a real opportunity there for businesses to access that to help improve your operational emissions. And Marion, who's here from the Combined Authority, will be talking a bit more about that in a bit. We're also about to launch a £1 million Business Innovation Fund, the third phase of that, and that's really focused around the climate emergency ambitions and helping businesses to research, develop and innovate new products and services around this climate emergency space. So that's launching imminently in the next month or so. So do keep a lookout for that on our website.
Thank you. It strikes me that, when I look at the work that Business West have been doing to support businesses, that through the Combined Authority there's many routes now. We've heard of many others today. And we need to get better at how we pool and channel people into those resources. But it's really pleasing to hear that we've got so much activity going on. There's a question that's come up through from the floor, actually. And Stephen, I'm going to direct this one to you. And that is, in a sense, what are Bristol doing around some of the physical climate resilience requirements? And I'm also just interested to how that might tie into things like the City Leap and one or two aspects. I wonder if you could just...
Thanks. I mean, I think I mentioned earlier, there is an unanswered funding question, but I think Marvin talked about investment, not cost.
That's right.
Because if we just took a different view about patient capital, this is actually money you get back.
Yeah.
So nowhere more so than in flood defences. There's a classic example there where people in this room will probably know about major schemes that need to be brought forward in the city that can create jobs, houses. At the moment, we don't have a funded solution to all of the flood defence needs. Yeah. We have taken an outline case through the first stage of the process, but that's an example of where infrastructure needs to come in, because the business case will always make itself in the long run when you look at those kind of big systemic investments to unlock resilience. So that's an example of something we haven't quite fully worked out yet, but we're going to. It needs to happen. You mentioned City Leap. This is something, to quote Simon earlier, or misquote, this is one where we didn't have all of the answers, but we did it anyway, which is effectively, we acknowledge that the private sector wants to crowd money into places, but they don't actually have an easy way of doing that. Some local authorities, I'm told, can be quite hard to do business with. I haven't met one, but I gather they do exist. So what City Leap is actually a wrapper around the council's estate, its opportunities for a 20-year concession, effectively. And we're in a procurement now, so I can't say too much, but a lot of it is public knowledge. When and if that works, which we'll know by about February, March next year, that will effectively be a partnership 50-50 with the private sector, bringing in money, expertise, and networks. It's going to be looking at continuing the work about expanding out the heat network in the city and also decarbonising our housing stock. So 15% of Bristolians live in our housing. So you've got those big chunky bits of infrastructure where if you can aggregate as a local authority, to your point about our powers, you can actually accelerate business investment.
Thank you, Stephen. Just picking up on your point around Bristol doing a great job and we're taking many leadership positions. I'd be interested, Anne, whether through the work that you do with Arup and others, whether you've got any views as to other city locations where there are lessons for us to learn and things for us to absorb.
Well, there are always things for us to learn, as much as we like to kind of claim that we're Bristol and we're best and we were the first to declare a climate emergency, and there is a lot to be proud of in Bristol, but there's always a lot to learn from elsewhere. I mean, in the UK, I'd point to places like London and what they've done with planning policy. I'd point to places like Manchester, where working regionally, I think they've done more than we have. All over the place we can learn from. Work we've done in the not too distant past with New York on their climate action plan, and the positions that they're taking. Lots to learn from everywhere.
Thank you. We have to be open to all of those things. John, you mentioned the recent announcement around the City Regional Sustainable Transport Settlement. That's going to bring over £500 million into the City region to be spent over the next 5 years. Some of that is around real behavioural and modal shift. Perhaps Barry and John, I'd be really interested in your views as to how we accelerate and how we persuade citizens, as others have said before, to get out of cars and onto buses and other forms of transport. John, any initial thoughts?
I think the first thing is to make it as easy as possible. And that's what the program's there to try and do. It's trying to make those networks and those routes for people to travel without their cars as easy as possible. One of the key things, thinking about the just transition we talked about, is actually making it easy for people to seek employment opportunities via our public transport routes or via walking and cycling routes. And that's one of the kind of key ambitions of that plan. But it's kind of working out how we get more people back onto buses, more people back onto trains, and also how we encourage more walking and cycling by making those routes accessible and easy to use for people.
Thank you. And Barry, from your perspective?
I'd probably start in a slightly different place, and with the transport hierarchy, reduce the need for travel in the first place.
Yeah.
And so, stop the need for travel in the first place, and then active travel modes before you go down to the bottom of the hierarchy, and probably put EVs in the same place as internal combustion engine vehicles. And so actually turning the travel hierarchy on its head and reducing the need to travel in the first place. And from a local authority point of view, fundamentally that's what planning is about. That's what proper spatial planning does. But beyond that, South Gloss is involved in, for example, trying to reopen Charfield Station. So it's accepting that it's a rural community surrounded by other rural communities who are largely car dependent to carry out their journey to work movements. But actually the council really understanding that and wanting to work quite hard to open a formerly closed railway station on the main line into Bristol, which comes through South Gloss. In terms of reducing the need to travel as well, we're looking at master plan work for Yate and Kingswood to actually model that. I think it's been mentioned before about 15-minute communities. So actually, how can we actually redesign those communities away from a central retail function within those town centres, actually to provide a range of services that does exactly that. It reduces the need to travel in the first place.
Thank you. And Stephen, I'll just come back to you. I'm quite interested around the natural and built environment in the context of many of the influences, and I've seen a lot of work going on around housing delivery and how we can perhaps reduce carbon. Perhaps you could just talk a little bit around some of your programmes and how you're sort of reflecting on some of the policy shifts or the nudges that you can make through your capital delivery programmes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is it needs to be built into everything.
Yeah.
And we obviously have a constrained city and the population is growing. And if you don't plan for the growth, it'll happen in places and in ways you don't want and expect. So you're reimagining ourselves into that place and starting with our local plan, which clearly will follow when the spatial development strategy is signed off, is the really most important part, because without those building blocks, you're not giving the development sector, the signals. Within that, clearly there is a need to ensure that wherever we deliver housing, for example, we deliver ecological net gain. That's important. It's increasingly just a given that that's what's happening. We have to have a conversation, as you will know. Marvin has spoken to the city about densification. We've got a massive change in the city centre when it comes to the retail floor space reducing, and obviously COVID has accelerated that. There are a lot of cities where bringing people back into the city centre is just good for the environment, it's good for cohesion, you can have intergenerational living. So that's all happening, and it's happening really, really fast. At the same time, we've got a housing crisis, and the population is going to grow by 70,000 in the next 20 years. So we have to get ahead of it. And actually, cities are good, economically productive, ecologically efficient ways to cater for growth. We need to acknowledge people want to come to Bristol. It's a good place to live. Quality of life is excellent. And we need to continue to invest in ecologically good outcomes for them.
Stephen, thank you. And I'm going to just sort of bring the final point to the end of our session to Anne. We've heard a lot around actually how policies and the public sector can influence so much of what's going on. We also have a real important role for the business community, and I wonder, Anne, if there are any sort of thoughts or reflections from your experiences and the work with the City Board, the Environment Board, around how business can get behind and support the work of the public sector.
So I think recognising that no one organisation is going to solve these challenges alone is really critical. And as businesses, I mean, particularly businesses like ours who operate kind of all over the country, all over the world, having a real clear view into the cities that we work in and engaging with the places that we work, because all of our employees live and work in those cities, and so we all really care about it. So I think that's the key point really, is just engaging in the places that we work.
Thank Thank you. Well, I think on that note, where there's a responsibility for us to engage in the places where we live and work, I'd like to say a huge thank you to the panel, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Can I ask you to come back at 10 past on the dot so that we can make sure we get as much out of the next panel as possible? Thank you all and the current panel.